1,500 years ago of the Hindu god Krishna was carved into the sacred mountain of Phnom Da in southern Cambodia. More recently, the sculpture has traveled to France, Belgium, and Spain before its recent stop in America. Right now, the larger-than-life-size sculpture, Krishna lifting Mount Govardhan, is being featured in an exhibition at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Asian Art in Washington.
We actually know the original location of the sculpture. It was in a cave temple about halfway up the mountain, and it was really a site-specific installation. So what we're doing with this exhibition is trying to bring the original landscape and the whole religious and sociological culture that created this masterful sculpture into the space of our museum.
The exhibition titled Revealing Krishna, Journey to Cambodia's Sacred Mountain centers on the Krishna sculpture, which was restored by staff at the Clifton Museum of Art in partnership with the National Museum of Cambodia. Before the 13th century, the now Buddhist nations of Cambodia was once a Hindu kingdom full of Hindu structures and sculptures. Krishna lifting Mount Govardhan portrays the eight-year-old Krishna who lifted a mountain with just one finger to shield the villagers and cattle from the raging storm sent by the angry god of rain, Indra.
This image of Krishna lifting the mountain that's in this floodplain in the Mekong Delta, an area that's agricultural based, that's reliant on the monsoon, this image of the flood and of a storm would be really powerful. So having this beautiful sculpture of Krishna just standing inside of a cave as if he really is lifting up the mountain would be an extremely powerful and resonant emblem of protection.
Contemporary Cambodian communities worldwide are predominantly Buddhist, and most of the ancient Hindu masterpieces like Krishna and the Angkor Wat Temple complex have been adapted to Buddhist practices. The immersive exhibition also features a 30-minute documentary about Buddhism and how ancient religious sites played a role in the belief journey of 4 Cambodian survivors who escaped the communist Khmer Rouge regime that killed more than 1.7 million people in the late 1970s.
Well, I was able to put together a short documentary film called Satu. Because when you go to the temple, when you pray, you always say Satu, Satu, Satu 3 times.
The family members who died in the war.
Luong Eng, best-selling author of First They Killed My Father, is one of the 4 survivors in Satuk and co-narrates the exhibition's visual timeline with Angelina Jolie. She said this exhibition is a great honor for Cambodia.
I'm so happy to see people walking through the exhibit and enjoying Khmer art and culture and music and scenery, because we as Khmer people know how beautiful Khmer is.
Revealing Krishna, Journey to Cambodia's Sacred Mountain is on view for free through September 18.
All over Seattle, Washington, you can find fun, colorful creatures: bears, squirrels, squids, buffaloes, unicorns, celebrating the city's creative spirit. Muralist Ryan Henry Ward's newest works are lively additions to walls of several small businesses and a local preschool.
I'm painting a Sasquatch and kind of a self-portrait, obviously. He likes his coffee, I like my coffee. And there's a lot of Pacific Northwest and Seattle kind of elements in this painting. So we got Mount Rainier, which is a big volcano mountain close to Seattle. And then there's the Seattle skyline in the background with the Space Needle and some other little features. And we're the evergreen state, so I put a evergreen tree in there.
Not only do Ward's brightly colored wild creations bring joy to the city, but they also celebrate his overcoming a dark period of his life, one that began with pain medication following a four-wheeler accident.
Got addicted to opiates and got addicted to alcohol, and just kind of got into really heavy use of those things so I could originally kind of manage my pain, and then it just kind of shifted into addiction. And that kind of created some mental health crisis in my life.
That addiction led to homelessness.
It's hard out there and it's dangerous out there. And like I saw a lot of brutal things living on the streets. And yeah, it's been about 10 years since then. And I just live with a sober mind, and I do all this artwork from a perspective of clarity, I guess.
Worth's designs are now seen in local gift shops, mini-golf decorations, books, and now an exhibit where visitors are encouraged to touch the art.
I created more of like a kind of like a record store kind of feel to my place, where you get to shuffle through the art with your hands and you get to pull out and kind of discover. It kind of allows you to dig in and kind of discover.
Not all his work is bright. Worth says he still explores the abstract, dark and moody.
So the hair is kind of over his face, and he doesn't have like high functioning limbs, and the colors are more muted, and so this is kind of like pulling on a feeling of like I still want to like participate and show up for the day, but I don't really want that to be around other people, or I don't want to be seen.
When he's feeling low, Worth says it is the discipline of painting every day that gets him through.
This sprawling port city, being set up on land reclaimed from the sea in Colombo, is meant to compete with Dubai as a business hub. It is the latest of huge Chinese-funded infrastructure projects in Sri Lanka that include a port and an airport in Hambantota. But as an unprecedented economic crisis leaves Sri Lanka with virtually no foreign exchange reserves to buy fuel and food or repay foreign loans, these projects are under scrutiny. Billed as economic game changers, analysts say they have yielded few returns.
For example, the airport in Hambantota is called the emptiest airport in the world because it really is not attracting the business that it should be attracting. So there's a lot of questions in terms of whether these kind of projects have also contributed to Sri Lanka's increasing debt.
Chinese loans make up about 10% of Sri Lanka's $51 billion foreign debt. The Chinese-built infrastructure had showcased Beijing's growing clout in the strategic country in the Indian Ocean. However, now a massive public backlash against President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and his brother Mahinda Rajapaksa, who sanctioned many of these projects, will influence future policies.
The Rajapaksas are seen as very much tilting towards China. So I think there is going to be a more balanced foreign policy and trying to get more assistance from different and diverse actors.
That is good news for India, for which the Chinese presence close to its southern shores had become a strategic headache. New Delhi has committed to provide $3 billion to Colombo in loans, credit lines and credit swaps since the crisis spiraled. It has also shipped food, fuel and medical supplies to ease hardships caused by the massive shortages of essential commodities.
It was seen as an opportunity for India to also demonstrate its commitment as a net security provider in an economic sense. That India as a regional power could support Sri Lanka in a time of crisis, and thereby underscore its credentials as a responsible regional power.
Ahead of Sri Lanka's rice sowing season, New Delhi plans to send fertilizer to help farmers who suffered massive crop losses as the government ordered a switch to organic farming. As India emerges as one of the biggest aid providers, its image as a dependable ally is being reinforced.
The fact that India has come through in terms of addressing urgent needs, urgent humanitarian needs, is very welcome by many Sri Lankans. And that, I think, I speak to across the board. Many are realizing that India is a true friend.
For New Delhi, recovering ground lost to China is a boost as it tries to counter Beijing's growing clout in South Asia.
1-year-old George is in for a treat this morning. His formula is mixed with cereal. Mom Lindsay Cates is slowly transitioning to whole milk since this is her last carton of formula and she can't find any more.
would go to the next grocery store and then go to the next grocery store, and I would send my husband out on little manhunts to, check out the CVS, the Target, the Whole Foods to see if we could still get it.
Last month, formula started disappearing from store shelves. Supply chain issues were blamed. Contamination and recalls led to the closure of the nation's largest formula producer, Abbott Laboratories of Michigan. Moms resorted to Facebook and the drastic decision to buy breast milk from strangers.
I'm a mom of 5.
Heather Christian of Minnesota with 6-week-old Isabel Jadri is selling her breast milk for $1 an ounce. One customer buys $50 worth a week.
You can't produce any milk, and you can't go buy the formula because it's not there. What are you going to do to feed your baby?
The Michigan formula plant has reopened. The Biden administration activated the Defense Production Act to use military planes for formula deliveries and is currently receiving millions of bottles of infant formula from Australia. But experts predict shortages to continue beyond supply chain corrections.
We also know that some of the ingredients used in baby formula are going to be harder and harder to get because of other things going on in the world, such as the dependence on sunflower oil from Ukraine.
By the time formula cans fill the shelves again, George and other wee ones will be moving on to soft food and cow's milk to grow big and strong.
Deforestation and wildfires contribute to climate challenges faced by nations of Latin America and the Caribbean. But climate adaptation presents an opportunity, said President Joe Biden as he presented summit leaders with a proposal to reduce dependence on fossil fuels.
When I hear climate, I think jobs. Good paying, high quality jobs will help speed our transition to a green economy of the future and unleash sustainable growth.
At the Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles, Biden welcomed 23 heads of state to discuss sustainable economic growth, migration, health, and other regional challenges. His climate plan aims to promote investments in clean energy. Observers say it's a long road between ideas and results.
I think those summits, as we know, involved a lot of announcements and not always announcements that are translated in concrete policies and concrete developments for the region.
The initiatives may meet resistance from Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro, a climate skeptic who reportedly demanded a bilateral meeting with Biden as a precondition for his summit attendance.
We are doing all we can, of course, to meet our needs, to foster our interests, and also to accommodate the will of the wider world. As I said before, we are an example in the eyes of the world when it comes to an environmental agenda.
Overall, the region understands the need to fight climate change, especially Caribbean island nations facing the immediate dangers of rising sea levels.
It is very clear that even the poorer countries have to invest with their own resources. If the U.S. supports us, fantastic.
The summit continues Friday, when leaders will turn their focus on another regional challenge, migration. The 9th Summit of the Americas opened with fanfare in Los Angeles, one of the most diverse places in the United States.
27% of us are foreign-born, but over 50%, half our children, have one or more parents that are foreign-born. It just doesn't exist anywhere else but here in the state of California.
But behind the celebration, a sobering reality. Latin America and the Caribbean have seen the deepest economic contraction due to COVID-19.
22 million more people fell into poverty in just the first year of the pandemic. Inequity continues to rise. Global inflammatory pressures were made worse by Putin's brutal and unprovoked war against Ukraine.
Biden announced $300 million in food insecurity aid and launched the Americas Partnership for Economic Prosperity.
The American Partnership will help economies grow from the bottom up and the middle out, not the top down. What's true in the United States is true in every country. Trickle-down economics does not work.
The initiative will not include new trade agreements that many leaders in the region seek, and it is unclear how much money the United States will commit to the effort. The United States already has free trade agreements with about a dozen Latin American countries, and there is little political appetite in Washington for more.
There really is, tremendous potential to build out a new dispensation for the economic ties between the United States and the region. But it does have to include some hard initiatives, and I believe it has to include significant commitment of resources.
The summit is overshadowed by the absence of 8 leaders, one due to COVID and others as protest to U.S. exclusion of the leaders of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, who were deemed undemocratic. Still, leaders are set to adopt initiatives, including an action plan to prepare for future pandemic threats and improve the skills of health workers. The U.S. has donated more than 65 million vaccine doses to the region. Further aid is in jeopardy. The administration's $5 billion global pandemic funding has been stuck in Congress for months. More than 2.7 million people in the hemisphere died from COVID-19, 40% of the global total.
Britain is giving Ukraine an unspecified number of M270 launchers, seen here being used by the US Army during recent exercises, which can fire 12 precision-guided rockets up to 80 kilometers in under 1 minute. The decision was coordinated with Washington, which is sending similar M142 high-mobility artillery rocket systems, or HIMARS, seen here on the right.
What MLRS systems like HIMARS and the M270 will do will be to provide the Ukrainians with the range to engage some of the longer-range Russian systems, as well as a precision-guided capability, which will enable things like counter-battery fire against long-range Russian assets.
The British government said the missile systems would help Ukrainian forces protect themselves against Russia's brutal use of long-range artillery. The Kremlin's forces have made incremental advances in recent weeks in the eastern Donbas region.
The Russians do enjoy a substantial advantage in terms of the sheer number of systems they field, so they can make up in just mass what they lack in precision.
The results are clear on the battlefield. Towns and cities left in ruins.
They hit all this territory with grads every 10 meters.
Western-supplied anti-tank missiles helped drive back Russian armoured columns advancing on Kiev. Now, the nature of the war is changing.
In this position, it isn't that effective because their tanks don't come closer than 3.5 kilometers, and this weapon can't effectively reach the target at that distance.
Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin said his armed forces would react if the West supplied long-range missiles to Ukraine.
If they are going to be supplied, we'll make certain conclusions and use our own means of destruction, of which we have enough to strike at targets that have not yet been hit.
Britain and the United States said they had received Ukrainian assurances that the long-range missiles would not be fired into Russian territory. Moscow warned of absolutely undesirable and rather unpleasant scenarios if that happened. Months of speculation over Boris Johnson's leadership culminated in a vote among his own Conservative lawmakers Monday evening.
The vote in favour of having confidence in Boris Johnson as leader was 211 votes, and the vote against was 148 votes. And therefore, I can announce that the Parliamentary Party does have confidence.
Cheers from Johnson's loyalists, and the Prime Minister put on a positive spin.
I think it's an extremely good, positive, conclusive, decisive result, which enables us to move on, to unite and to focus on delivery.
Johnson won the vote, but over 40% of his own MPs want him out of office.
This really is a pretty bad result for the Prime Minister. And what it means going forward, I think, is that prime ministerial survival will be the foundation stone of this government.
Boris Johnson delivered the Conservative Party a thumping 80-seat majority at the 2019 election by promising to get Brexit done. Polls show his popularity has plummeted. Last week, he and his wife Carrie were booed by sections of the crowd at Queen Elizabeth's Platinum Jubilee. So what went wrong? He is the first British Prime Minister to be convicted of breaking the law while in office, after police investigations into parties held at his Downing Street residence during COVID lockdown, so-called Partygate. Johnson had previously told MPs that no such parties were held.
Firstly, a number of his own MPs cited the fact that he had clearly lied to Parliament as a reason for voting against him. And secondly, those same MPs have seen the Prime Minister's popularity ratings with the British public tank.
The Prime Minister's problems run deeper.
Whether it be Partygate, whether it be a sense amongst his own backbenchers that there is no coherent plan for government, or whether it be the fact that actually the Conservative Party is divided.
Historically, British Prime Ministers who suffered significant rebellions haven't survived long in the job, including Margaret Thatcher, John Major, and Boris Johnson's predecessor, Theresa May.
Boris Johnson is slightly strengthened by the fact that there is no obvious successor.
Johnson's supporters say he has got the big calls right, giving military support to Ukraine, delivering on the Brexit referendum, a fast COVID vaccine rollout. But his critics say he is now a political liability, and their calls for him to resign are unlikely to die down. Asylum seeker Hadi, not his real name, fled persecution in his home country of Iraq because he is gay. He shows the scars of a recent attempted rape. He reached Britain in January after crossing the English Channel on a small dinghy. Now he is terrified of being sent to Rwanda.
We suffered and escaped death. We crossed the sea, all to be sent to Rwanda? Kill me or sentence me to death instead of sending me to Rwanda. I don't have anything to do with Rwanda. As a gay person and a supporter of refugees, this is an unjust and criminal decision.
Hadi is among the more than 10,000 migrants this year alone who have crossed the English Channel in small boats to reach Britain. Dozens have died attempting the crossing. Britain says the flow has to stop. Earlier this year, British Home Secretary Priti Patel signed a deal to fly asylum seekers 6,000 kilometres away to Rwanda for processing there as a deterrent to migrants hoping to cross the channel.
We're a government, along with our partners, the government of Rwanda, finding new innovative solutions to global problems where I'm afraid other organisations and other countries, are not coming up with alternatives, and the status quo is simply not acceptable anymore.
The migrants will be housed in hostels like this one in Kigali.
At some point, once their status has been fixed, they will have to go and live with other Rwandans, but they will be free. They will not be prisoners.
The first flight, taking around 100 migrants to Rwanda, is scheduled June 14th, but the policy has been widely criticised, including by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. A group of non-governmental organisations has launched a legal case to halt the flight. Among them is the charity Care for Calais.
People come from Sudan, Syria, Iraq, Iran. They are all terrified. They have all fled their home countries due to absolutely terrible circumstances. A number of them have suffered extreme torture or trafficking.
The plaintiffs say the policy breaches international refugee conventions.
There's got to be some domestic UK law that you rely on, because those treaties don't automatically become part of British law.
Lawyers for the migrants argue they could be denied a fair hearing in the Rwandan asylum system. Separately, lawyers are also arguing that specific individuals named on the flight should not be sent to Rwanda.
So it could be somebody who's been a victim of trafficking, for example. It could be somebody who has been wrongly age assessed as being an adult, and actually they say they're a child. It could be somebody who's got a serious illness.
A court ruling is expected in the coming days.
With intense and previously unseen video. and in testimony from a documentary filmmaker and a U.S. Capitol police officer who suffered a traumatic brain injury.
I saw friends with blood all over their faces. I was slipping in people's blood.
6 Democratic and 2 Republican lawmakers made public for the first time their year-long investigation into the January 6, 2021 breach of the U.S. Capitol.
It was domestic enemies of the Constitution who stormed the Capitol and occupied the Capitol, who sought to thwart the will of the people, to stop the transfer of power. And so they did, so at the encouragement of the President of the United States. The President of the United States trying to stop the transfer of power, a precedent that had stood for 220 years.
Trump was impeached in January 2021 for inciting that riot, just 1 week before leaving the White House. Lawmakers leading the congressional investigation, encompassing hundreds of interviews and thousands of documents, said they will go further, making the case Trump planned and executed a violent coup to hold on to the presidency.
President Trump summoned the mob, assembled the mob, and lit the flame of this attack. You will also hear about plots to commit seditious conspiracy on January 6th, a crime defined in our laws as conspiring to overthrow, put down, or destroy by force the government of the United States.
This first hearing focused on the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, extremist groups with individuals who have been charged with seditious conspiracy in connection with the January 6 attack. Filmmaker Nick Kested testified about filming those groups that day.
I documented the crowd turn from protesters to rioters to insurrectionists. I was surprised at the size of the group, the anger and the profanity.
All but a handful of congressional Republicans have already claimed the investigation's results are illegitimate.
It is the most political and least legitimate committee in American history. It has used congressional subpoenas to attack Republicans, violate due process, and infringe on the political speech of private citizens.
But in 4 more hearings throughout this month, committee investigators said they would prove Trump made a coordinated, multi-step effort to overthrow the results of the election. With upcoming midterm elections deciding control of Congress, the stakes for making that case are high.
It was a clear, flagrant violation of the Constitution. I think these guys and women broke the law, tried to turn around the result of an election.
The January 6 committee does not hold any legal power, but can recommend prosecutions to the Justice Department. To date, more than 725 individuals have been arrested for their actions that day.
The Turkish army continues to build up on the Syrian border ahead of an operation targeting Kurdish forces of the YPG group. Ankara designates the YPG as terrorists linked to the PKK insurgent group that is fighting Turkey. Until now, Ankara has been constrained because American forces are fighting with the YPG against the Islamic State group. Washington is warning against any operation. But with the United States needing Turkey's support to admit Sweden and Finland into NATO, Ankara sees an opportunity.
Turkey believes that diplomatically it is in a strong position at a time when the members of the NATO alliance we need Turkey to give a green light to NATO enlargement, and therefore the possible criticism that this could trigger in the West would also be more limited.
The operation seeks to expand Turkey's control of Syrian territory on its border. But in a bid to minimize tensions with Washington, the scope of the assault was reduced to avoid areas where American forces are present, instead focusing on Russian and Damascus regime-controlled areas where the YPG also operates. But analysts warn major risks remain.
There is no question that Damascus will not be very happy, but it may not be strong enough to object. But if the Russians do not allow Turkey to use airspace, then it will be very costly and maybe even impossible for this operation to succeed. In addition to that, Iran is extraordinarily unhappy with any Turkish intervention. They have declared this. And the Russians are speaking with both sides of their mouth, actually.
With Erdogan refusing to impose sanctions on Russia over Ukraine, Ankara retains leverage over Moscow. Initially, Moscow appears sympathetic, but is now voicing concerns over Turkey's intentions in Syria. During planned talks Wednesday in Ankara, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is expected to drive a hard bargain for a green light to a Turkish-Syrian operation, which analysts say will add to Washington's concerns.
Any operation, threatens instability and likely entails trade-offs that the Turks will make with the Russians on a bilateral basis. And so this is a time when Washington would like to isolate Russia. And so even bringing this in as part of a Syria operation is something that Washington wouldn't like to see.
With President Erdogan languishing in the polls as he faces re-election next year, any Syrian operation, analysts say, will likely play well with his voters.
Nice to meet you, Ursula.
European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, during her recent visit to Kyiv, met with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky to discuss the country's reconstruction and progress toward European Union membership, as the EU is set to debate the issue in the weeks ahead. The head of European Commission told Eastern European leaders this month it's in EU's strategic interest and the moral duty to welcome Ukraine into the 27-member group. Von der Leyen also said Ukraine would first have to meet EU standards and requirements.
No shortcuts, no wildcard. Standards and conditions have to be met because this is true for all of us in the European Union, and we know on a daily basis how hard it is to keep these standards up among us 27.
Ukraine's long-standing effort to move closer to European Union helped spark the 2014 Revolution of Dignity, also known as the Maidan Revolution, after Ukraine's pro-Russian-backed leader at the time refused to sign a popular trade agreement with the EU. The deal was eventually signed. Days after Russia's February 24th invasion of Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky sent a letter to start the process of attaining candidate status. But some EU members, including the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Austria, are reluctant to grant Ukraine candidate status. Ukraine's First Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Emina Japarova, told VOA that reluctance is an EU internal issue.
The main is that it is not about Ukraine, it is something that is about within EU as a crisis of vision, as a crisis of the future of the EU, with the special stress that there is the waiting list of countries, especially when it comes to the Western Balkan countries that have been waiting for so long.
Maria Mezentseva, who had the Ukrainian delegation to the Council of Europe, says Ukraine has completed 63% of the terms in the EU association agreement, which is used to bring countries in the region closer to EU standards and norms.
It's going to be a green sign for Ukraine and the project of the EU, which started back in 1950s for the purpose of promoting peace, preserving peace, and creating a club for peace. So the green light for us and a green light for the further integration and development, and a red card for Putin, so he can't say, look, but you're not wanted there.
The U.S. ambassador to the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, Michael Carpenter, told VOA that Ukraine's integration with the West is also in America's interest.
This is the best way for Ukraine to anchor itself in a set of institutions that preserve its democracy, its sovereignty, its territorial integrity, and all the attributes of independence that we support and have long supported inside Ukraine.
After Ukraine emerged from the war, Carpenter says it will rebuild to become a stronger, more resilient and united country than before.
President Donald J. Trump.
So far, committee members lay the blame on former Republican President Donald Trump and his ongoing contention that the November 2020 election was stolen from him.
We fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
The evidence is very powerful that Donald Trump began telling this big lie even before the election, that he was saying that any ballots counted after Election Day were going to be inherently suspect. That lie continued after the election and ultimately led to this mob assembling and attacking the Capitol.
Recalling the events of the day, lawmakers focused on then-President Trump's inaction as his supporters turned violent. Some chanted for then-Vice President Mike Pence to be hanged if Pence didn't take extraordinary action to subvert the election results.
President Trump was yelling and, quote, really angry at advisors who told him he needed to be doing something more. And aware of the rioters' chants to hang Mike Pence, the president responded with this sentiment, quote, maybe our supporters have the right idea. Mike Pence, quote, deserves it.
Cheney went on to call her Republican colleagues' unwillingness to stand up to the former president dishonorable. Others in her party want to look forward, not back at the past.
I look at it this way, he has already left. I think we should be looking more forward on this, but we'll see what the evidence comes out with in regards to the president. I'll just say what he did was wrong. He should have spoke up. When it gets to the legal matters, I'm a little less confident on. I'm not a lawyer. I need support.
At the hearing, law enforcement officers testified to the unforgettable events of January 6, 2021.
What I saw was just a war scene. It was something like I'd seen out of the movies. I couldn't believe my eyes. There were officers on the ground, you know, they were bleeding, they were throwing up, they were, you know, they had, I mean, I saw friends with blood all over their faces. I was slipping in people's blood.
More than 800 people have so far been arrested in connection with the attack on the Capitol. Trump, for his part, has labeled members of the committee as political hacks. The rioting occurred 2 weeks before Democrat Joe Biden was sworn in as the 46th President of the United States.
After cooking for decades on a stove lit with firewood, women in North India's Sarmatla village were excited when they got cooking gas connections under a program subsidized by the government. But now the liquefied petroleum gas cylinders lie unused, as many return to cooking with wood.
Everything has become so expensive, and I'm poor. As daily wagers, we barely earn $4. Tell me, should I buy food for children or buy gas?
For many homes, the $13 price tag for a gas cylinder after a series of hikes in the last year and a half has made it unaffordable as they grapple with high food prices and declining incomes due to the pandemic. Despite a $2.50 subsidy that the government recently gave rural households, it remains out of reach.
I only cook vegetables on gas. I make everything else on a wood fire.
It's a setback to the ambitious program, under which over 80 million rural households got cooking gas connections. The aim to address problems caused by these smoky fumes.
Now that indoor air pollution is equivalent to a person smoking significant number of cigarettes continuously at the same time. Now, broad estimates suggest that India loses 500,000 of its population every year prematurely because of this indoor air pollution.
These women live with those health consequences.
I cough, I get congestion and breathing problems. Then I try to cook on the gas stove.
With a wood stove, I get coughing spasms. I feel pain in my eyes and I get breathless.
It is not just poor households that have been hit. Even better off households in the village use cooking gas sparingly.
It is a huge challenge to cope with inflation and high cooking fuel prices. When I am told that it is time to refill the gas cylinder, I get really worried.
The number of households using clean energy rose from about 30 to 70% between 2011 and 2020. Those gains are now under threat.
At the very least, this has stalled the progress. At worst, this has reversed some of the progress. So unless the prices would get again attuned or get limited through either subsidy support or the decrease in global oil prices, we may see that households may not now shift towards LPG for most of their cooking.
That means there may be no early end to these women breathing these deadly fumes.
Як жити змії без рук і без ніг? Треба перезавантажитися зараз.
The rehearsal is over. Now the curtains can open. Artist Vitaly Ruppelt is creating a graphic poster right here in his cramped Lviv apartment. Art is a weapon, believes Ruppelt, who is following in the footsteps of his favorite graphic designer, Ukrainian insurgent army artist Nil Khasevich, who died in 1952.
Історія повторюється і повторюється, і визвольні змагання.
History repeats itself. The liberation struggle of the 40s and 50s, and now it's happening again. On day 3 of the invasion, I got involved and remembered who I am.
Ruppelt's military-themed posters are distributed around the world with the help of Lana Mitsko, director of the Lviv Municipal Art Center.
These posters are being sent to other cities, sometimes along with humanitarian aid, sometimes with the journalists traveling from Lviv further on. We usually provide them with samples. This is reactionary art.
While part of the art center is still under renovation, a large part of it is being occupied by children and adults who have fled the military action.
Seeing these beautiful things that the young children are making as a way of therapy against the evil that's happening into their lives, it's very, very powerful.
British art curator Vanessa Branson arrived in Lviv after visiting Bucha and Hostomel. Founder of the Marrakesh Biennale and sister of billionaire Richard Branson, she seeks to see something else in this war, a new beginning and flourishing among the ruins.
The invasion has been very focused on destroying cultural museums and churches and any cultural object that makes a Ukrainian feel Ukrainian rather than Russian. And on the one hand, you've got this destructive force coming in, just destroying everything. And on the other hand, as a sort of defense, you've got people creating, never before has culture felt more vital and actually exciting.
These are fragments of a Russian missile that hit Lviv. Volunteers and artists painted the missile remnants and put them up for auction to raise money for the Ukrainian army's needs.
While donations were coming in fast in the first days and weeks of the war, today we have to be creative to figure out how to attract more funding every single day. One of the ideas was to draw Saint George, patron saint of Lviv, on the remnants of a Russian missile.
It's not just some deformed piece of metal. You know that this is an aggressor's missile. It was really scary to touch it. I wanted to get an idea through, to cover all this evil, so to speak. I painted our jet fighter on it, a MiG-29 flying in that direction, tearing barbed wire that I painted in Russian tricolor.
But even as these artists keep Ukrainian culture alive in art, Ukraine's Ministry of Culture has reported that Russian forces have destroyed or damaged more than 30 museums and reserves, 116 architectural monuments, and more than 130 churches.
It's been a year since Bernard Njengaland, his wife Esther Thuku, had died in Saudi Arabia, where she had been a domestic worker for 3 years. He says Saudi authorities reported his wife had committed suicide at her employer's home, but he believes the mother of 4 was murdered.
Her body did not have any marks that would show that she had hanged herself, because there would be marks around the neck. It appeared her body had been buried because it was very dirty and looked like she had been stabbed on the left side. That wouldn't have been hanging at all.
Kenyan authorities say that since November, at least 23 domestic workers have died while working in the Middle East. Most of those deaths occurred in Saudi Arabia, according to labor officials. Saudi authorities have reported that all 23 of those deaths resulted from cardiac arrest. In April 2020, Amnesty International reported that Kenyans who have jobs as domestic workers in the Middle East often complain of lack of payment, forced labor, physical abuse, rape, and dangerous working conditions. Now, Kenya is offering safety training for domestic workers who take jobs abroad.
So when you don't train them, then basically you are exposing them to exploitation and abuse. Part of the training also includes labor rights awareness. They have to know how to bargain and to talk to employers about decent terms and conditions of employment.
These are among 30,000 Kenyans who migrate to the Middle East to find work each year. Kenyan authorities say they're working with Saudi officials on labor law reforms.
We would want, in case, we would want them to also upscale their laws to protect workers and employer equally, not to discriminate and have the attitude of employer is right always. Number two is that the pay is reasonable, commensurate to the work.
VOA reached out to the Saudi embassy in Nairobi for comment on alleged mistreatment and death of Kenyan workers. In an email response, the embassy said the kingdom does not condone illegal and ill treatment of anyone and said Riyadh is working with Nairobi to protect citizens from any offense. Meanwhile, officials say with an estimated 2 million young people graduating each year and only about 800,000 new jobs according to national figures, many Kenyans will continue to go abroad to find work.
Peter Otieno, a clearing and forwarding agent at the Port of Mombasa, says his business is still recovering from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, he is worried about competing with international shipping lines which have started offering full services previously done by Kenyan businesses.
When we have left the business open such that the shipping lines can come here, open their offices, then after opening the offices, they do even clearing, they do the transport.
Kenya has no commercial shipping vessels. According to the Shippers Council of Eastern Africa, foreign-owned shipping lines control up to 92% of Kenya's international freight trade. The law previously restricted global shipping lines from providing added services, leaving more business to local companies. But since winning a Kenyan court case in 2017, these shipping lines have consolidated cargo unloading, forwarding, and other services in what is called a vertical integration model. Workers' unions argue international shippers have an advantage because they make initial contact with the clients and can offer them full services first, costing local jobs and business.
In the last 1 year, here in Mombasa, we have lost almost 50 members who are operating companies, now not operating.
The World Trade Organization Safeguard Framework allows member countries to develop regulations to protect local companies from unfair competition. In this case, local businesses say they are being hurt by uncompetitive practices. The Shippers Council of Eastern Africa backs the vertical integration model, saying it streamlines operations, improves efficiency, and it's a global model that is here to stay. But the council adds it understands the workers' concerns and is calling on Kenya to adopt regulations to address job losses.
So what we need is to have regulations that are actually able to control how this happens. That even when it happens, our interests as a region, as a Kenya, as a corridor, as locals are taken care of.
But freight companies at the Port of Mombasa, already struggling to deal with the impact of the COVID pandemic, fear they will be pushed out of business.
We need to defend the clearing and forwarding companies that are operating in this country, which is the investment of the local Kenyans.
Industry insiders in Kenya say without measures to protect them, local companies may be dealt a fatal blow.
This German Shepherd was born in early 2022 at K9 Center in Irpin near Kiev. 2 months later, Russian troops began bombing the city.
The enemy attacked us from the air a lot. Some of the missiles were aimed at our dog training center.
One of Russia's missiles did hit the dog training center. Luckily, no staff members, dogs or people were injured, training center commander says. This young dog managed to save everyone. Some 15 seconds before the shelling, he started barking uncontrollably, alerting the K9 staff who decided to run for shelter. After this incident, the dog was named Bayraktar after Turkish-made attacking drone. Bayraktar's owners weren't sure whether it was a coincidence until it happened again and again. Now, when Bayraktar starts barking, everyone runs for cover.
As soon as he started behaving a certain way, we just knew shelling was about to start, and we ran to the bomb shelter.
In March, Russian tanks entered Irpin, but miraculously spared the dog training center.
On March 7th, we saw tanks over there. They were approaching, but suddenly stopped and turned around. Maybe because there were battalions of Ukrainians standing near us. During the Russian occupation, we were in the so-called gray area, always under fire.
The trainers decided to evacuate breeding dogs, the ones that could have valuable litter. Only the animals that showed psychological resistance to constant explosions remained in the center with their owners. Occasionally, the dog left the center to work. Looking for evidence of sabotage, the dogs searched suspicious vehicles for weapons and explosives. They also accompanied people fleeing Irpin.
We used dogs to inspect luggage for explosives. We also helped the elderly and people with kids to get out of the city. All bridges leading to Kyiv were blown up, and it was very difficult to leave Irpin.
In early April, after Irpin was liberated, the dog training center resumed its work. Bayraktar is now getting ready to become a special search dog.
He is very active and clever. We will train him to detect saboteurs and looters.
But it won't happen for a while. The training will require some special gear, which was destroyed in the bombing.
What is the metaverse? Tech companies and others describe it as a place where the real world will mix with the digital, even more than it does now. But beyond that,
right now, we are essentially hearing the first whispers of a metaverse, and there's very little to say like this will be the future. All we're really doing is really at the brainstorming phase of what should it look like.
The term metaverse refers to a three-dimensional immersive world as compared with the two-dimensional world of screens we experience today.
It's not just looking at video or even virtual reality on your screens or through displays, but really having a kind of a digital layer, if you will, thrown on top of the entire world.
The great thing about the metaverse is it captures the point that it's all connected. It's like the internet that you walk into.
Betting big on the metaverse is Facebook, which recently changed the company name to Meta and opened its Meta store. Visitors try on virtual reality headsets, play with other wares, and contemplate the metaverse.
If you want to go to the moon, maybe it's hard for every people, but in the metaverse, just a second, and then you go to the moon.
Some see the metaverse as a place to hang out with friends.
I would like to be in a virtual chat room with my friends for, 4+ hours. If I could have that level of immersion where I could be connected constantly in my room or wherever I please, that would be the main draw for me.
Observers say it will take years for the metaverse to come to be. For now, people are considering what their digital lives hold next.
In Denver, artists are looking beyond the social constructs of marriage to alternative visions of illness and devotion in an exhibition called In Sickness and in Health. Co-curator Genevieve Waller's Chains of Love combines the symbol of something strong with cellophane, a weak material.
What are these chains of love? What more, besides marriage equality, can we do to make the world more equitable for people who don't want to get married, who can't get married, who don't believe in the institution of marriage?
Cherish Marquez imagines traditional folk medicine known as curanderismo transforming everyday objects to clean the earth of radiation poisoning.
Traditionally, curanderismo is used to heal the body, spirit, and the mind. And as a queer person that comes from Latinx heritage, I found that some of the religious philosophies from Catholicism really didn't fit and accept my identity, and curanderismo as a way to have take back that culture and space.
The photographs of Mika'ayo Cole create bookmarks of places and emotions that ease feelings of being alone, even in a crowd.
It's almost like a double whammy for us, right? If we're queer and we have like a mental disability or mental health going on, and mental health is going to be affected because of those forces that are, you know, however they're playing, we need to talk about it more, that's all.
Co-curator Mary Grace Bernard is looking for audiences to find similar experiences, even if they don't identify the same way.
My work, this body of work, is kind of like a private moment with me, with all my medical equipment. It's something that you don't see me as I'm here now, but when I'm at home, I'm attached to a lot of devices and have to do all these treatments and medications.
Jeff Rufus Bird recreates his 2017 stroke as a video game, because like people having a stroke, characters in video games do not control what's happening to them.
The idea of queerness itself is not always something that's entirely associated with sexuality. It's sometimes used in a context of someone who just has very unusual life circumstances or something that's a bit outside the norm, perhaps.
Waller says gender identity and disability often pass unnoticed.
Queerness and disability, often people require a performance of it in order to take it seriously. So unless you are wearing a rainbow or in a wheelchair or what have you, sometimes people don't want to believe you when you say you are gay, you are disabled.
The show is part of Pride Month activities that return to in-person events for the first time since coronavirus.
The number of
lockdowns.
displaced persons in Myanmar keeps climbing as clashes between the military junta and anti-military forces continue. Now reporters are fleeing to borderlands and neighboring countries as the junta imposes more restrictions and punishments on reporters working there. Here in Thailand, journalists like Shaw Mu continue to do their work, documenting evidence in Myanmar despite the risks. She is wearing a face mask and hat to protect her identity for security reasons.
When you go inside, you also have to face, afraid of the Burmese army shelling, everything. So when they see you, they also feel very happy because they know that some people take care for them.
Sang Lee, not his real name, is a news editor covering Myanmar. He also asks that his identity be protected for safety reasons. He, like other journalists, is working in a neighboring country to avoid laws that rights groups say are ambiguous and target critics of Myanmar's army. Getting access to information is expected to get even worse in Myanmar under new cybersecurity legislation that is expected to become law. The proposed measure would forbid the use of virtual private networks or VPNs, which allows users to access social media sites which have been banned by the military-backed State Administration Council, or SAC.
Myanmar is not like other country. So before that, Myanmar is called the Facebook nations because 99% of the public use the Facebook. So that's why the SAC also try to ban the Facebook.
Sang Lee says some journalists, like Hantar 9, also face trumped-up charges that could add years to their prison term. He received a 2-year sentence after being charged for spreading false news. But authorities added another charge under the Electronic Transactions Law that could add another 7 years to his sentence. Hantar's family says they have not been allowed to see him.
They don't allow to see my brother. But if I have a chance, I want to see my brother because we don't know actual situation of my brother, like not only physical condition but also mental condition.
Despite the mounting risks that come with the job, Myanmar journalists continued to get the word out as the crisis within the country worsens.
1, 0. Ignition and liftoff.
We begin this week on a launch pad in Cape Canaveral, Florida, where a SpaceX rocket carried an Egyptian communications satellite into space. Nilesat 301 will provide broadband internet for the Middle East and Africa. The reusable booster carrying the satellite has previously launched crews to the International Space Station among a handful of other missions. Next, we visit Australia's Arnhem Space Centre, from where later this month NASA plans to blast off its first rocket from a non-US commercial port.
This is about not just the rocket launches itself, but it's about sending a message to younger Australians and indeed Australians of any age who might be looking at retraining for future careers of how important science is.
The Prime Minister stressed the importance of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education, or STEM, as part of Australia's future. NASA looks to launch 3 research rockets beginning in late June from the facility owned by Equatorial Launch Australia and located on Indigenous land. In other news, NASA's problem-filled Artemis program took a step in the right direction this week as the agency prepared its 30-story Space Launch System rocket for a critical dress rehearsal. This follows an April setback in which NASA was unable to fill the rocket's fuel tanks. If all goes according to plan, and by now that's a big if, NASA could launch the rocket carrying the Orion spacecraft on a passengerless flight around the moon later this year. Also this week, we remember cosmonaut Valery Ryumin, who went to space 4 times after becoming a cosmonaut in 1973. He spent a total of 371 days in space in 2 short missions and 2 record-setting long-duration flights. Ryumin died this week at the age of 82. Meanwhile, from Van Horn, Texas, space tourism company Blue Origin completed another successful trip after a subpar rocket backup system delayed the flight last month. The 10-minute, 6-passenger journey was the company's 5th crewed launch.
To infinity
and beyond. Finally this week, out-of-this-world news for fans of the Toy Story movie franchise. Disney's release of Lightyear explores the origins of a beloved character, Space Ranger Buzz Lightyear. For kids of all ages, the worldwide release later this month can't come soon enough. To infinity and beyond.
As U.S. President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden welcomed heads of state to the Summit of the Americas, where migration in the Americas has been a major topic, immigrant rights activists demanded that the status of undocumented migrants in the United States be resolved. An abortion rights supporter chained herself to the summit fence as the U.S. Supreme Court once again weighs the controversial issue. And other protesters objected to the summit host, the United States, excluding Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela from the meeting. The U.S. saying only democratic countries are welcome. Prompting several nations not to send high-level delegations. Critics called the exclusion of certain countries hypocritical.
Because you have nations that are invited, like Bolsonaro in Brazil, who's having his own personal meeting with Biden, who has extremely repressive policies, who's burning down the Amazon, who's not representing the needs of his people or the planet.
She also said the Biden administration is considering a trip to Saudi Arabia, whose government is widely accused of playing a role in the 2018 murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Analysts say the purpose of the visit, which is not yet confirmed, would likely be to stabilize oil prices. A smaller event called the People's Summit for Democracy was held nearby and drew 1,000 participants a day from 15 countries for the duration of the summit.
We feel the Summit of the Americas has excluded millions of people from this region. Black and indigenous people, women's groups, workers and peasants. It's excluded us from the debate.
The Biden administration says economic development, the environment, migration, women's welfare, and democratic rights are central to the agenda. The summit has also sponsored youth and civil forums. Mexico, whose president stayed home, sent its foreign minister. A Mexican senator, who is Secretary General of her country's ruling party, attended the People's Summit. She says despite disagreements, she hopes for a strong relationship between the two countries.
It means Mexico wants a new relationship with the United States. And it proposes a new relationship between all the countries of the Americas, where there is not constant intervention or summary judgment toward the determination of each people.
Both the Summit of the Americas and the People's Summit ended Friday night. the official meeting with a declaration of accomplishments, and the People's Summit with another protest.
There was much expectation in Moscow to see what the new restaurant that will take the place of McDonald's would be like once the American firm decided to permanently leave after Russia's assault on Ukraine. Alexander Gavor, a Siberian mining tycoon, is the oligarch who decided to revive the 800 restaurants left behind, with a menu now almost entirely with local ingredients. Behind the hamburgers, there is also a political message.
Without a doubt, I am a patriot. That is fundamental for me. But this is not directed against anyone, not against America or any other country.
After 3 months closed, the place reopens its doors under the name of Vkuzno and Tochka, which could be translated as tasty and that's it. Although customers interviewed said they will continue to use the name of the American firm.
I think we'll keep calling it McDonald's.
The new restaurant, with a menu largely copied from its predecessor, was sold out on its first day, with mixed reaction from fans of the American-style fast food.
I've tried everything, hot, cold, salty, and sweet. Everything is good.
I really liked the previous brand image, its color and its strength. Now everything seems more sedate, sadder.
McDonald's arrived in the Soviet Union 32 years ago as the country was opening to the world. It is now leaving the Russian market indefinitely, but it is also leaving behind an unmistakable imprint of American culture.
For these Ukrainian dancers, an artistic tour around France has turned into an indefinite stay. As they performed in Paris late February, Russia was invading their homeland.
The day happened, everybody were on the phone, everybody allowed to bring their phones on the stage so they could stay with their families. Everybody was shocked, everybody didn't know what to do.
Paris City Hall has granted Ivan Kozlov's company artistic residency. This theater and others are putting them up at a suburban hotel.
We met with Madame Lamère, Anne Hidalgo, and we spoke on the stage. And she said that now Théâtre du Châtelet is our base. We can work here, we can perform here.
Other key dancers have since joined the troupe here in Paris.
After the war started, I understood that I can't literally live without things I usually do, without ballet. Yes, and I understood that this is exactly the thing which can save me. When we came here, practically no one knew each other, but right now we are really a very friendly.
Everyone here has family and friends back home, caught up in some way by the fighting. The troupe is raising money for their homeland.
At first I wanted to return to my family, but my parents said it wasn't necessary. They wanted me to stay here and be safe.
We are the father and mother of 35 children in here. We all the time trying to organize everything and to keep them safe, to keep them healthy. It is very difficult to plan ahead. Very difficult because everything is changed. All the time we're trying to prepare some tours, but you know, like usually tours preparing the year ahead.
There's one thing Kozlov and his dancers are sure about.
My message is we are unbreakable. Wherever it's happened, Ukraine will stand.
Like a good fairy tale, Kozlov believes Ukraine will win the war.
The latest sign of U.S.-China tensions. These Chinese and Russian military planes flew late last month near U.S.-Asian allies' airspace, while U.S. President Joe Biden was on an Asia trip aimed at countering Beijing. Russia's war in Ukraine has only deepened the U.S.-China divide. Although China has not openly supported Russia's war, it has pledged closer ties, worrying many in Washington.
It's identifying with a very aggressive country, and the United States worries that That's the way China wants to approach the situation in Taiwan as well. Use brute force to achieve its objectives.
China views democratic Taiwan as part of its own territory. It threatens to take it by force. Biden has promised the United States would defend Taiwan if China invades, raising fears of a superpower conflict. Taiwan will be a major focus when Austin meets his Chinese counterpart in Singapore this week, although analysts say the meeting is unlikely to result in any progress.
The Taiwan issue is possibly the issue where there's greatest divergence between the two superpowers.
The United States and China have both increased their shows of military might in the region surrounding Taiwan. Many other countries fear they could be drawn into major conflict.
Most in the region prefer to have incremental steps in tuning down the temperature, knowing that it is not possible to resolve such a complicated issue, at least find some common points where they can sort of make the atmosphere much more conducive for talks.
There are possible areas of U.S.-China cooperation, including climate change and the North Korean nuclear issue. But with ties in their current state, the space for working together may be small.
It may look like timber, but these planks used for this dining set are made of recycled plastic. Hudson Tepofa started his business building with these planks at his home in the township of Katlehong after he lost his job during the coronavirus pandemic. He says it's created employment for himself and 2 other staff and contributes to environmental protection.
It is safe to do the recycling so that we can save our environment, because the animals, they won't die from those plastics and everything. Our dams, they won't be dirty. So I think that's the way to save our community.
The 34-year-old now gets regular orders for outdoor furniture and playgrounds. South Africa is one of the world's top countries for recycling plastic, capturing about 45% of plastic waste. This recycling plant makes durable and sustainable timber with plastics that are too low in quality to be reused for packaging or other materials. Recyclers say it's extending the lifespan of plastic used in everyday life.
When you wake up in the morning, you will touch or interact with plastic more than 100 times before you get into the office. And that's from turning on the light switch to your toothpaste. The problem we have with plastic is it's visible and it pollutes. Not plastic pollutes, people pollute.
The economic incentive for recycling plastic has given rise to an informal waste picking industry. People gather and separate materials to sell to recyclers, providing them with income. But the informality of the business means waste pickers don't have access to all neighborhoods or industrial areas, so the material ends up as litter or in landfills.
Because South Africa is such a disposing country, there's plastic everywhere for us to collect. There's no proper structures that fight against the redirecting of plastic from going to the environment.
Globally, 460 million metric tons of plastic are used annually, half of which are for packaging. That's set to triple by 2060, with a 6-fold increase in sub-Saharan Africa, according to a new report by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And recycling is not keeping up, capturing only 9% of plastic waste globally, which is why environmentalists say reducing plastic consumption, especially non-essential packaging, is necessary.
In Africa, there's lack of financial capacity, human capacity to collect this waste efficiently, and so recycling is a problem. This needs to be looked at from businesses and government, because we need to change the default and the normalization of just offering consumers plastic continuously.
Even with a reduction in plastic use, there would still be plenty of recycled material for creators like Tepofa to transform for new uses.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is meeting with a number of his counterparts in Los Angeles at the Summit of the Americas. But the U.S. has singled out Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, excluding them from the summit. Blinken noted that 17 media workers have been killed this year in the Western Hemisphere. 11 of those were killed in Mexico.
No region in the world is more dangerous for journalists. Crimes like these persist in no small part because the people who order them and carry them out are so rarely held accountable. That sends a message that these attacks can continue with impunity.
At the Student Journalist Forum, Blinken was asked why America's close ally, Israel, has faced no repercussions over the killing of Palestinian-American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh.
I deplore the loss of Shireen. She was a remarkable journalist, an American citizen, as you all know. And there, too, we are determined to follow the facts and get to the truth of what happened to her. No, they have not yet been, I'm sorry, with respect, they have not yet been established.
A CNN report on the killing cited witnesses who said Abu Akleh had been shot to death in what appeared to be a targeted attack by Israeli forces. Israel strongly denies the allegations and says it is investigating the killing, which has ignited outrage and protest. U.S. President Joe Biden is weighing plans to visit Saudi Arabia, despite saying he would make Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman a pariah over the killing of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. Experts say this is another test case to watch to gauge the president's commitment to freedom of the press.
But the desire to lower gas prices is really bringing an interesting tension between what the administration had said on the one hand would be a human rights-based foreign policy and a policy that serves the middle class. Well, the middle class in America really hates $4, $5, even $6 a gallon gas.
Experts say soaring gasoline prices are likely one of the factors behind Biden's shift on meeting with the Saudi Crown Prince.
The world is feeling the effects of the war in Ukraine, from the gas pump all the way to the dinner table. Food prices are rising just about everywhere, and experts say it's happening at an especially bad time.
So it's kind of a perfect storm. It's not just a matter of food prices are going high. It's food prices are going high at a moment when many places are already crippled by the challenges posed by COVID, by political disruptions elsewhere, by droughts and floods and other natural disasters. And there's only so much that people can take before they grow displeased with their political leadership if it's failing to take care of them. So unrest is unfortunately increasingly likely right now.
So how did we get here? Russia is the world's leading wheat exporter. Ukraine is number 5. Together, they grow about a quarter of the world's wheat exports. But when war broke out, the Black Sea became a combat zone. Some cargo ships were hit. It didn't take sanctions to cut off exports.
There wasn't a ban on grain trade, but in effect, the ports were closed. And so shipment has stopped.
Countries that import from Ukraine and Russia have suddenly found their contracts canceled, and they're not getting food shipments they were expecting, which forces them into the market to pay a premium to replace food shipments that just aren't going to arrive, and that bids up the price of food around the world.
But food prices have been rising for almost 2 years now. It's partly because bad weather cut the harvests in some of the world's bread baskets. Reserves are low, and that's helped push prices to record highs even before the conflict started.
We've kind of tipped over that edge where every change, every little thing has a very large impact.
Now Ukraine's next harvest is in doubt. Farmers should be getting ready for the next growing season, but that's hard to do right now.
Logistical lines are obviously heavily disrupted right now, so seeds aren't arriving, fuel isn't arriving, fertilizer isn't arriving.
Russia's farmers are getting hit too. They're not under sanctions, but Russia's banks are, and that basically shuts Russian farmers out of the financial system.
We're going to say you can't ship grain, but will they ship it if they can't get paid?
Then there's the increase in energy costs that makes shipping everything more expensive. Also, natural gas is a main ingredient in fertilizer, which farmers use to boost crop yields. That means fertilizer costs more to make.
Fertilizer prices last year were already quite high. They had come down somewhat in the last few months and now are very high again, in part because Russia and its ally Belarus are major fertilizer exporters.
And Russia and Belarus are both under sanctions for the invasion of Ukraine. But those are problems for the next crop. Parts of the Middle East and North Africa are feeling the effects right now.
Yemen's a good case in point. There's not a lot of wheat being grown in Yemen. They depend entirely upon wheat imports, and that requires transportation to get there. So the spike in global wheat prices plus the spike in global oil prices mean that prices for flour and for bread products in Yemen are already increasing significantly in a place where people really can't afford to face an even higher cost of feeding their family basic daily rations.
In 2011, rising bread prices were one of the factors that set off the Arab Spring protests. When people already have grievances with their government, food price inflation can push them over the edge. A lot of places fit that description right now.
If you look at Yemen, if you look at Lebanon, if you look at Syria, if you look at South Sudan, if you look at Ethiopia, and I can keep going, these countries are already in trouble because of conflicts.
On the plus side, spring planting hasn't started yet in some of the big wheat-growing countries. Farmers will probably switch some of the land that they plan to plant soybeans or corn to planting wheat. Eventually, that should bring the price down.
That seems to be the main way that these crises are inevitably resolved, is by production somewhere else in the world responding. And we are fortunate that we have a global food system. We have the ability to produce and consume commodities like wheat all around the world.
It'll be months before the market has a sense of how big that next harvest will be. In the meantime, it's going to be some nail-biting months of watching the weather. It could be a wild ride.
The attack on the U.S. Capitol back under investigation this week as the second of 7 congressional hearings alleging former President Donald Trump attempted to overthrow the 2020 election results resumes.
He betrayed the trust of the American people. He ignored the will of the voters. He lied to his supporters and the country. And he tried to remain in office after the people had voted him out, and the courts upheld the will of the people.
Investigators said that on election night 2020, the president insisted on declaring victory.
This is a fraud on the American public. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
Despite warnings from his top campaign advisors.
It was far too early to be making any calls like that. Ballots were still being counted. Ballots were still going to be counted for days. And it was far too early to be making any proclamation like that.
With the exception of a campaign lawyer, former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani, who witnesses said was drunk that night.
Mayor Giuliani was saying, we want it. They're stealing it from us. Where'd all the votes come from? We need to go say that we won. And essentially that anyone who didn't agree with that position was being weak.
Former Attorney General Bill Barr, the nation's top law enforcement official at the time of the 2020 election, testified the president had continued with false claims of fraud in the weeks after election night, even after it was clear he had lost.
I was somewhat demoralized because I thought, boy, if he really believes this stuff, he has, lost contact with he's become detached from reality if he really believes this stuff. When I went into this and would, tell him how crazy some of these allegations were, there was never an indication of interest in what the actual facts were.
Election officials from 3 key states and an election lawyer from the Republican Party also said the Trump campaign's subsequent attempts to prove fraud in court were unfounded.
The simple fact is that the Trump campaign did not make its case.
Committee lawmakers said the Trump campaign benefited from stretching out those fraudulent claims, raising millions of dollars that went to pro-Trump organizations.
We found evidence that the Trump campaign and its surrogates misled donors as to where their funds would go and what they would be used for. So not only was there the big lie, there was the big ripoff. Donors deserve to know where their funds are really going.
Almost all congressional Republicans have called the January 6th committee's work illegitimate and have continued to support the former president. Hearings will resume Wednesday and Thursday this week with a broader look at Trump's efforts to use the U.S. Justice Department to falsely claim he won the election.
With much fanfare, Sweden and Finland formally applied to join NATO in May. At the time, the application was seen as a formality, but now the bid is in jeopardy. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan says he will veto Sweden's and Finland's applications unless they end what he says is their support of the Kurdish rebel group, the PKK, which is fighting Turkish forces and which Ankara considers a terrorist group. Helsinki and Stockholm deny supporting the PKK. Finnish and Swedish officials say they are trying to address Turkish concerns.
The fact is that Turkey does hold a very important card, the veto card, and I think that this is not going to be resolved that smoothly.
The United States and the European Union have also designated the PKK as a terrorist organization. Erdogan is also calling for nations to stop supporting the Syrian Kurdish group, the YPG, which he says is linked to the PKK. Finland and Sweden and several NATO countries, including the United States, support the YPG, a key ally against the Islamic State militant group in northern Syria. But President Biden could be the real target of Erdogan's hardening stance over NATO enlargement.
Many people do think that the objections to Finland and Sweden are basically messages to the United States to take Turkey more seriously, to engage with Turkey, and for President Biden to, if you will, to resurrect that personal relation that President Erdogan established with President Trump.
Unlike his predecessors, Biden, who is critical of Turkey's human rights record, has largely refrained from directly interacting with Erdogan. Instead, analysts say Washington will work around Turkey's veto threat by deploying security forces with other NATO countries to Sweden and Finland, further isolating Turkey. Experts say the impasse is taking a toll on Turkey's economy, with the Turkish currency, the lira, now under added pressure. But analysts say this is a price Erdogan may be ready to pay, aware that appearing to stand up to NATO plays well with his voters.
The US State Department says the latest events in the Kherson and the Zaporizhia regions of Ukraine, currently occupied by Russia, indicate Russia's intent to create another so-called People's Republic there. In the Kherson region, the Russian-appointed deputy head of the regional administration hasn't ruled out the possibility of a referendum, like the one that preceded Crimea's annexation.
We'll announce later when some kind of vote or plebiscite is planned. But it won't be today and it won't be tomorrow, because our first task is to restore order in the Kherson region.
In recent weeks, Vladimir Putin signed a decree allowing residents of the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions to obtain Russian citizenship. By early morning on June 2nd, some 250 Kherson region residents applied for a Russian passport, according to the Russian-appointed Kherson administration. What's more, Russian SIM cards are now being sold in two occupied regions of Ukraine. And on May 31st, local Ukrainian authorities said internet and Ukrainian cell service had been cut off in occupied territories. American experts, however, say it's highly unlikely the two regions will join Russia.
None of these regions wanted to separate from Ukraine. These are Ukrainian territories. So if they tried to hold a referendum now, in light of the devastation that they caused, in light of the lack of any recognition from any other country for control over these territories, I think it'll be a joke.
Ukrainian TV channels stopped broadcasting in the occupied territories. Instead, residents can watch only Russian TV, which describes the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions as liberated. In addition, wheat from the previous year's harvest is being transported from the Kherson region to Russia. Local agrarians report raider attacks on their farms.
They bring their equipment, take the grain from the grain elevators, and take it to Crimea. From there, it goes to Sevastopol and gets sold there.
Many Ukrainian refugees who fled the country keep in touch with family and friends in Ukraine. Those who stay say they fear oppression from the occupiers, as well as a fake referendum that would make their region part of Russia. Men fear they will be enlisted and forced to fight their own people.
My close relatives are in Kherson, including my dad. Banks are not operating. It's impossible to withdraw money. Not salary nor a pension, nothing. Grocery stores are not working. Sometimes you can buy food directly from other people. But to be honest, everyone is afraid to leave their homes because there are many reports of people going missing.
Katerina Shkalyar lives in Zaporizhia. Lately, she's been volunteering, helping to bring humanitarian aid to the occupied area of the region.
They're not being bombed, but people are under occupation. Grocery prices have grown dramatically. Many people, of course, lost their jobs, the ones who didn't want to work with the occupiers. Many homes are being searched. Some men are taken away somewhere and held there for a few days. They are being asked to cooperate with Russian forces.
According to the New York Times, 1/5 of the Ukrainian territory is currently under Russian occupation.
We had a nice kitchen here. The house was very nice.
This is what's left of 82-year-old Alexandra Yahudina home after Russian shelling of her hometown of Irpin. She and her daughter Vera Malachina lived in this house for more than 20 years. The daughter recalls fleeing with help from the Ukrainian military.
We asked them to take us away. The shelling was awful here. Military men helped us to cross the river by pontoon bridge.
Malachina is 65 years old. She's been a commercial painter since a young age. 10 years ago, she had enough money saved to add on to and repair this old house. Now she and her mother are digging out whatever they can salvage.
People helped me to take out the fridge. It works. It's banged up, but I plugged it in and it works. I cook at the neighbor's house. They gave me the keys and let me take showers.
Alexandra Yahudina found a sofa.
I asked them to help me pull out of the rubble my sofa, so at least I could sit in the sun.
Now she spends most of her day here. When it rains, she hides in a small barn that survived the shelling. At night, the mother and daughter share a mattress on the floor. But Malachina says they're better off than others. Some of their neighbors don't even have a barn for shelter. Russian artillery destroyed everything.
We have at least something left. Our neighbor Shura, her house is the first one on Oktyabrska Street. There's nothing left of her house.
Occasionally, Vera tries to get into her ruined house to search for more items. She says the most precious one is a wedding photo.
That's my deceased husband. That's me and our classmates.
Alexandra is happy her flower pots survived.
I used to plant a lot of flowers when I lived in the village. My friends would ask me, "How do you do that?" I always answered, "It's easy."
Recently, Malachina received a small amount of monetary aid from the state. It's equivalent to about $65. Not enough money to begin rebuilding for now. Before the war began, Malachina says she was unable to work and was scheduled to undergo cancer surgery. But all that's on hold for now.
Everything got damaged. My son has cleaned it up already. Well, yes, I cried a lot because everything got destroyed.
Ukrainian authorities have promised to restore all the damaged residential buildings and already allotted 1 billion hryvnia, nearly $34 million for that purpose.
Currently, we have 400 million hryvnia to do restoration work. Will that be enough to let people get back to their restored homes? No, it won't be enough.
According to the Kyiv School of Economics, it's going to cost upwards of $39 billion to restore the damaged residential buildings in Ukraine. But many here say they can't wait for that and have started doing some of the rebuilding work themselves. A volunteer rebuilding battalion called Dobrobat is helping.
People can leave a message like, "Who can come and help me restore my home?" Volunteers put out those messages through Telegram channels, and whoever is free can respond and help.
Applications can be left on the Dobrobat website. There is a special form for volunteers who put in the help they can offer. Longtime construction worker Vadim Lavrik has put together a special team in the Sumy region. In the first 26 hours, more than 30 volunteers signed up.
Young women help us as well. One of them is probably 21. She hardly weighs more than 50 kilos. I often tell her, take just one brick at a time. They're too heavy for you. Another woman who helps us is an industrial engineer. Very different people, but all are incredibly talented.
So far, more than 27,000 people have volunteered to help. At the moment, Dobrobat is operating in the Kiev, Chernihiv and Sumy regions. Volunteers work in teams a few days a week. Volunteers mostly either clear debris or restore residential buildings.
If a person's roof is broken, their whole house will get damaged. It'll be filled with rainwater. It'll be impossible to live in. And when you think of it, all is needed is go over there, put some profiled sheeting on, and fix the roof. And we have a family living in their own home again.
While there is no shortage of volunteers, there is a shortage of materials and gas. That's why Dobrobat members are on the constant lookout for sponsors and funds. Banks and IT companies are helping as well. Dobrobat founders are creating a map with all the damaged buildings on it and looking for sponsors for each project.
After the appraisal is done, all the documentation and a brief description is uploaded to our website for the potential sponsors to see. Then we, of course, add the end pictures and all the financial accounts.
The Dobrobat founders plan to add more rebuilding battalions in the Kharkiv and Mykolaiv regions of Ukraine.
The founder of Bulava, Darya Pach, is originally from Ukraine and has been living in the United States for the past 9 years. She says when Russia invaded her homeland, she knew she had to help. So she boxed some basic necessities and sent the package, as she put it, to nowhere. She wanted to send another one, but this time asked some friends to help.
And at one point there were 12 of us, and we decided that this is the moment to organize a team that will not only just sell merch or just help Ukraine, but which will continue to help rebuild Ukraine.
Bulava, which means maze or club in Ukrainian, is made up of a few volunteers originally from Ukraine who live in Washington and the surrounding area. Most are young professionals, a nurse, an entrepreneur, a photographer, an IT specialist. Each Wednesday they hold a fair where they sell products with Ukrainian symbols. Many designs are inspired by the drawings of Ukrainian children. The group also holds large charity events to help targeted groups in Ukraine.
We do work with a few nonprofits and few organizations in Ukraine, also with a lot of volunteers. And since like a lot of big funds, Ukrainian funds, they help big organizations, so we're trying to fulfill the small orders and the small groups.
So far, Bulava has collected $38,000 in cash, as well as medicines, personal protective equipment, baby food, and more than $80,000 worth of clothes. The medications are handled by a head nurse at a Washington area hospital. Ekaterina Kashlaba has garnered help from hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, and doctors in private practices.
I, in principle, accept different orders from hospitals in Ukraine. We filter them.
Say, as the war drags on, it has become more difficult to raise funds. So they're constantly looking for new ways to get help to those living through a war back
Voice of
home.
America.
Amanda Bennett, a former director of the Voice of America, now the White House's nominee to head the 6 entities of U.S. Global Broadcasting with an annual budget of more than $840 million.
We're at a critical moment in history. Journalism and public diplomacy alike are targeted as never before by authoritarian regimes using mis- and disinformation to undermine those seeking credible, fact-based, and unbiased coverage of the world around them. Journalism has been my life.
A Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, editor, and manager for decades, in addition to her time at VOA, Bennett would be the second Senate-confirmed chief executive officer for the U.S. Agency for Global Media. The first CEO, conservative filmmaker Michael Pack, resigned at the Biden administration's request in 2021 after a controversial tenure marked by concerns about the independence of the agency under his leadership.
How we're going to maintain the reputation of USAGM and restore the sense among people on both sides of the aisle and across the planet that you are not doing anybody's bidding other than the bidding of fair and accurate information and the dissemination of facts across the planet.
I think that my nearly 50-year career in journalism, I have striven to make sure that I always uphold the principles of neutrality, nonpartisanship, unbiased reporting in journalism, and I intend to keep on fulfilling those principles. And those are the principles that USAGM wants at its very heart and soul to maintain. And there's no room for partisanship inside the Voice of America.
But critics have alleged that during Bennett's tenure, morale dropped and VOA coverage of China's handling of the coronavirus was soft. She defended her record reporting on authoritarian regimes and heard from Republicans who encouraged USAGM to combat propaganda worldwide.
At a time when press freedom and democracy are starting to decline, U.S. international broadcasting has a very important role to play. With authoritarian governments shut down the news and censor their people, this agency can give credible and timely and accurate information. There is a need to provide the international community with balanced and objective information. This is especially true in areas of the world where disinformation, propaganda, and terrorist ideology dominate the news.
Bennett's nomination is expected to pass the Democratic-controlled committee in the coming weeks before moving to a floor vote in the full Senate.
War crimes are violations of international humanitarian law. Intentionally targeting civilians, using child soldiers, and committing acts of torture and rape are war crimes. No single document codifies all war crimes. However, the core principles of international humanitarian law are enshrined in the Geneva Conventions, most of which came into effect after World War II, and the Rome Statute, which established the International Criminal Court, or ICC. Intention is a necessary component of a war crime. For example, shelling a hospital by itself is not a war crime, but doing so intentionally or recklessly would be. ICC. The ICC is charged with prosecuting individuals for war crimes and for crimes against humanity, such as genocide. While Ukraine is not one of the court's 123 members, it has granted the ICC jurisdiction. The ICC's chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, said in February that he would investigate suspected atrocities in Ukraine. Based on the court's findings, it could prosecute individual Russians for war crimes, but could not investigate the Russian state for crimes of aggression. That is because Russia, like the United States and China, has not signed on to the ICC. The ICC also cannot try people in absentia. So Russian suspects could not face trial unless they were physically present in the ICC's courtroom. Other options. Individual countries could prosecute Russian officials or military personnel for violations of international law under the legal concept of universal jurisdiction. Such cases, however, do not usually lead to enforceable punishments for the perpetrators. In addition, many national laws prohibit the prosecution of sitting heads of state, such as Russian President Vladimir Putin and senior government officials. Another option would be to establish a tribunal such as the one in Nuremberg, Germany, created after World War II to prosecute Nazi war criminals. Tribunals were also used to convict individuals of genocide and other charges following violent conflicts in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda.
A look at 4 ways the war in Ukraine could end. Russian win. Ahead of Russia's invasion, many Western intelligence assessments predicted a quick Russian victory. That did not happen. Ukraine mounted a strong initial response with highly motivated fighters and weapons from countries around the world. For Russia to win now, it must follow a more difficult path. Russian troops have attempted to capture major Ukrainian cities, but struggled after finding them already heavily fortified. As a result, Moscow shifted its strategy to focus on Ukraine's eastern Donbass region, where pro-Russian rebels have been waging a separatist rebellion.
If the Russians try to make a big push to surround the Donbass, that could be very difficult for Ukrainian forces to keep fighting in the way that they have been fighting. And it could make things difficult for resupply efforts by the US, NATO, and other allies as well.
If Russia were to try to capture major Ukrainian cities again, including the capital Kyiv, it would mean using ever more powerful strategies, including airstrikes. This would result in more civilian casualties. Russia has significantly more troops than Ukraine, as well as more weapons, giving it a large military advantage. Ukraine prevails. For Ukraine to prevail on the battlefield, it would need to earn victories against a much stronger Russian force. Military analysts say that to hold the capital, Ukraine might have to give up smaller cities. Ukrainian forces could continue to mount armed ambushes and attack Russian support lines, hoping to force a stalemate that leads to a Russian withdrawal.
And what Russia is doing so far is not really a pullback that shows that Russian forces are going to go home, back to Russia. In fact, what the US suspects is that the Russians are clearly just repositioning and regrouping, refueling, resupplying, and getting ready to go and attack Ukraine some more.
More likely, Ukraine could prevail through the combination of military successes and worldwide pressure on Russia. Russia is suffering from both economic sanctions and diplomatic isolation. The war could end with a diplomatic solution, especially if Russian ally China exerts strong pressure on Moscow. Another way Ukraine could prevail, a remote possibility, is if Russian President Vladimir Putin were removed from office. This would likely require ordinary Russians to revolt against the war, or elites to carry out a coup. Protracted quagmire. Even if Russia could capture Ukraine's major cities, an easy victory would not be assured. Ukrainian fighters could engage in a drawn-out insurgency that would last months or even years. Insurgents could dig deep into cities and hide on rooftops, in alleyways, and inside buildings. A well-coordinated force, armed with weapons from the West, could hold off a large assault for a long time. This could result in a stalemate. Such a conflict could lead to mounting casualties on both sides and wear away Russian resolve. This outcome would mirror Russia's fight in Afghanistan in the 1980s. It is not clear what Putin's goal is for Ukraine. If he wants to install a pro-Russian government, he would likely need a Russian occupation to support it. Such an occupation could also face prolonged armed resistance and lead to a protracted quagmire. Wider war. The worst-case scenario would be an expanded war that brings in other European countries. Such a war could involve several nuclear-armed countries. It could escalate quickly and lead to catastrophic outcomes. For these reasons, European countries, the United States, and NATO have been careful to try to keep the conflict from escalating. They made clear they were not in a war with Russia and ruled out sending troops. They also rejected the idea of a no-fly zone over Ukraine because it could lead to the downing of Russian planes. A wider war could still be unintentionally triggered by a series of missteps. It is also possible that Russia could intentionally escalate the conflict if, for example, it was facing defeat.
Russia is facing economic sanctions over its invasion of Ukraine from dozens of countries. The sanctions target a vast range of sectors. They also target individuals, including Russian President Vladimir Putin himself, his 2 adult daughters, as well as high-level government officials and leading Russian businessmen. The sanctions have cut Russian banks out of a key financial messaging system and frozen the assets of Russia's central bank. Russian aircraft cannot take off from, fly over, or land in dozens of countries. The U.S. has banned oil and natural gas imports from Russia, while many European countries have announced plans to scale back the use of Russian energy. Import bans affect dozens of other Russian products, spanning industrial goods to high-end items. The U.S. has suspended normal trade relations with Russia, while European countries are taking similar measures. The effectiveness of sanctions is hotly debated, with both proponents and opponents citing specific cases. Proponents say sanctions helped bring Iran to the negotiating table in 2015 and to agree to limit its nuclear activities. In South Africa, decades of international sanctions played a role in ending that country's apartheid government in 1990. The use of sanctions became prominent following World War I as countries sought ways to avoid the horrors of another world war. U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt used an oil embargo in 1940 to successfully persuade Spain to remain neutral during World War II. However, just 1 year later, Roosevelt cut off Japan's ability to buy U.S. oil, with drastically different results. Japan soon afterward bombed Pearl Harbor and increased its military assault throughout Asia. Part of its objective was to acquire more oil. An economic blockade of Nazi Germany also failed to deter the plans of Adolf Hitler. Moreover, the German leader cited concerns about sanctions as a reason for his territorial conquest. A study looking at more than 170 case studies spanning a century of economic measures found sanctions were at least partially successful only about a third of the time. Failures cited by the study include Cuba, where decades of U.S. sanctions have not led to the fall of the communist government, and North Korea, which has not given up its nuclear program in the face of international sanctions. The PIIE study found that sanctions are most successful when a country's goals are modest, such as the release of political prisoners. They are much less successful when seeking regime change and democratization. And they are the least successful when trying to stop a military operation. The sanctions against Russia have caused the ruble to swing in value and inflation in the country to rise. Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin acknowledged in April the situation is the most difficult in 3 decades for Russia. However, the sanctions have not so far stopped Moscow's military operation. Russia's foreign minister said in March that Russia would adjust its economy to the sanctions and that they would make the country stronger.
The world depends on cargo ships to deliver most of the goods people use. But the vessels burn low-grade fuel and send around 1 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere each year, according to the International Maritime Organization. They emit more carbon than a country the size of Germany. With international carbon regulations looming, shipping companies are adopting cleaner fuels, electric batteries, and other alternatives, and some are reconsidering the free energy source that once powered all seafaring vessels: wind.
Pretty much every vessel can take some type of wind propulsion.
Gavin Allwright leads an industry group whose members are reimagining wind power for the 21st century, thanks to new technology, materials, and design. There are kite sails, rigid wing sails, and spinning columns called Flettner rotors.
The wind hits the rotating cylinder and it creates a pressure differential, and that creates thrust going forward.
Some new ship designs aim to be fully wind-powered, but wind technology can also be added to existing ships to reduce a percentage of fuel use. Among the world's largest vessels, 2 are already wind-assisted.
They're burning hundreds of tons of fuel per day. If you get 5 to 10% saving on a massive container ship, that is huge amount.
Those savings can increase if a ship follows a course based on wind conditions.
If you adjust your routing, you may be a little slower to port, but you're catching better wind conditions. So we can see those being optimized up to maybe 30% or more.
Wissamo, which uses inflatable sail wings, is a project of tire maker Michelin.
It's very simple. It's like two buttons, one to say on off and one to orientate the mast in the wind direction. So basically there is no impact on the crew.
The autonomous system uses sensors to gauge wind conditions and adjust the sails. And because it's inflatable,
when you arrive under a bridge or for all the operations at the port, then it's very easy to retract the wing.
Wissamo sails have been tested on a yacht, and the company plans to install them on a cargo ship this year. While closely resembling Bibendum, also known as the Michelin Man, the character who has represented the tire maker for over a century, the sails also point to a future of innovations in mobility.
Almost 1500 years ago, a monumental sculpture of the Hindu god Krishna was carved into the sacred mountain of Phnom Da in southern Cambodia. More recently, the sculpture has traveled to France, Belgium, and Spain before its recent stop in America. Right now, the larger-than-life-size sculpture, Krishna lifting Mount Govardhan, is being featured in an exhibition at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Asian Art in Washington.
We actually know the original location of the sculpture. It was in a cave temple about halfway up the mountain, and it was really a site-specific installation. So what we're doing with this exhibition is trying to bring the original landscape and the whole religious and sociological culture that created this masterful sculpture into the space of our museum.
The exhibition, titled Revealing Krishna, Journey to Cambodia's Sacred Mountain, centers on the Krishna sculpture, which was restored by staff at the Clifton Museum of Art in partnership with the National Museum of Cambodia. Before the 13th century, the now Buddhist nations of Cambodia was once a Hindu kingdom full of Hindu structures and sculptures. Krishna lifting Mount Govardhan portrays the 8-year-old Krishna who lifted a mountain with just one finger to shield the villagers and cattle from the raging storm sent by the angry god of rain, Indra.
This image of Krishna lifting the mountain that's in this floodplain in the Mekong Delta, an area that's agricultural based, that's reliant on the monsoon, this image of the flood and of a storm would be really powerful. So having this beautiful sculpture of Krishna just standing inside of a cave as if he really is lifting up the mountain would be an extremely powerful and resonant emblem of protection.
Contemporary Cambodian communities worldwide are predominantly Buddhist, and most of the ancient Hindu masterpieces like Krishna and the Angkor Wat Temple complex have been adapted to Buddhist practices. The immersive exhibition also features a 30-minute documentary about Buddhism and how ancient religious sites played a role in the belief journey of 4 Cambodian survivors who escaped the communist Khmer Rouge regime that killed more than 1.7 million people in the late 1970s.
Well, I was able to put together a short documentary film called Satuk. Because when you go to the temple, when you pray, you always say Satuk, Satuk, Satuk 3 times.
The family members who died in the war.
Luong Eng, best-selling author of First They Killed My Father, is one of the 4 survivors in Satuk and co-narrates the exhibition's visual timeline with Angelina Jolie. She said this exhibition is a great honor for Cambodia.
I'm so happy to see people walking through the exhibit and enjoying Khmer art and culture and music and scenery, because we as Khmer people know how beautiful Khmer is.
Revealing Krishna, Journey to Cambodia's Sacred Mountain is on view for free through September 18.
All over Seattle, Washington, you can find fun, colorful creatures: bears, squirrels, squids, buffaloes, unicorns, celebrating the city's creative spirit. Muralist Ryan Henry Ward's newest works are lively additions to walls of several small businesses and a local preschool.
I'm painting a Sasquatch, and
Kind of a self-portrait, obviously. He likes his coffee, I like my coffee. And there's a lot of Pacific Northwest and Seattle kind of elements in this painting. So we got Mount Rainier, which is a big volcano mountain close to Seattle. And then there's the Seattle skyline in the background with the Space Needle and some other little features. And we're the evergreen state, so I put a evergreen tree in there.
Not only do Ward's brightly colored wild creations bring joy to the city, but they also celebrate his overcoming a dark period of his life, one that began with pain medication following a four-wheeler accident.
Got addicted to opiates and got addicted to alcohol, and just kind of got into really heavy use of those things so I could originally kind of manage my pain, and then it just kind of shifted into addiction. And that kind of created some mental health crisis in my life.
That addiction led to homelessness.
It's hard out there and it's dangerous out there. And I saw a lot of brutal things living on the streets. And yeah, it's been about 10 years since then, and I just live with a sober mind, and I do all this artwork from a perspective of clarity, I guess.
Ward's designs are now seen in local gift shops, mini-golf decorations, books, and now an exhibit where visitors are encouraged to touch the art.
I created more of like a kind of like a record store kind of feel to my place, where you get to shuffle through the art with your hands and you get to pull out and kind of discover. It kind of allows you to dig in and kind of discover.
Not all his work is bright. Ward says he still explores the abstract, dark and moody.
So the hair is kind of over his face, and he doesn't have like high functioning limbs, and the colors are more muted. And so this is kind of like pulling on a feeling of like, I still want to like participate and show up for the day, but I don't really want that to be around other people, or I don't want to be seen.
When he's feeling low, Ward says it is the discipline of painting every day that gets him through.
This sprawling port city, being set up on land reclaimed from the sea in Colombo, is meant to compete with Dubai as a business hub. It is the latest of huge Chinese-funded infrastructure projects in Sri Lanka that include a port and an airport in Hambantota. But as an unprecedented economic crisis leaves Sri Lanka with virtually no foreign exchange reserves to buy fuel and food or repay foreign loans, these projects are under scrutiny. Billed as economic game changers, analysts say they have yielded few returns.
For example, the airport in Hambantota is called the emptiest airport in the world because it really is not attracting the business that it should be attracting. So there's a lot of questions in terms of whether these kind of projects have also contributed to Sri Lanka's increasing debt.
Chinese loans make up about 10% of Sri Lanka's $51 billion foreign debt. The Chinese-built infrastructure had showcased Beijing's growing clout in the strategic country in the Indian Ocean. However, now a massive public backlash against President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and his brother Mahinda Rajapaksa, who sanctioned many of these projects, will influence future policies.
The Rajapaksas are seen as very much tilting towards China. So I think there is going to be a more balanced foreign policy and trying to get more assistance from different and diverse actors.
That is good news for India, for which the Chinese presence close to its southern shores had become a strategic headache. New Delhi has committed to provide $3 billion to Colombo in loans, credit lines and credit swaps since the crisis spiraled. It has also shipped food, fuel and medical supplies to ease hardships caused by the massive shortages of essential commodities.
It was seen as an opportunity for India to also demonstrate its commitment as a net security provider in an economic sense. That India as a regional power could support Sri Lanka in a time of crisis, and thereby underscore its credentials as a responsible regional power.
Ahead of Sri Lanka's rice sowing season, New Delhi plans to send fertilizer to help farmers who suffered massive crop losses as the government ordered a switch to organic farming. As India emerges as one of the biggest aid providers, its image as a dependable ally is being reinforced.
The fact that India has come through in terms of addressing urgent needs, urgent humanitarian needs, is very welcome by many Sri Lankans. And